Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases in American history. Today, we'll delve into a mystery that spanned centuries, hidden among the mountains of North Carolina, where the silence of the Catholic Church guarded secrets that should never have been forgotten. Comment on where you're watching from as we unravel this dark story together. The year was 1849. The city of Asheville was just beginning to take shape in the valleys of the Appalachians, an isolated region where mountains created natural barriers and winter could trap travelers for weeks. North Carolina still bore the scars of westward expansion, and in that rugged territory law was a distant presence. Religious communities were beginning to settle, bringing faith and order to lands that many considered wild. It was in this context that Sister Catherine Marlowe arrived, a nun of the Order of the Sisters of Mercy, sent from Baltimore to establish a small mission near Asheville. Buncombe County records show her arrival in March of that year, accompanied by 2 other nuns. They came with the mission of providing education and medical care to the settlers scattered throughout the mountainous region. Catherine was 28 years old when she set foot in those cold lands. According to letters preserved in the Baltimore Diocesan archives, she was described as a woman of unwavering faith, determined and fearless. She had left a wealthy family in Massachusetts to dedicate her life to religious service. Her first weeks in Asheville were recorded in a personal diary that survived the test of time, kept in a wooden chest that would only be discovered decades later. In that diary, Catherine described the landscape with admiration. The bluish mountains at dawn, the sound of streams cutting through deep valleys, the dense fog that covered everything before sunrise. But she also recorded something disturbing. She mentioned a constant feeling of being watched when she walked through the woods near the mission. She spoke of strange lights seen in the distance at night, of whispers that the locals made when she passed by. The mission operated in a simple wooden building, hastily erected by the colonists, who saw in those nuns a hope for civilization. The chapel was small, with rough benches and an improvised altar. There, Catherine conducted weekly masses, attended to the sick, and taught reading to those willing to learn. The first month seemed to unfold as expected until autumn brought events that would change everything. In October 1849, Catherine began receiving nighttime visits from locals who preferred not to be seen in daylight. These were unsettling confessions, accounts of practices condemned by the church, stories of secret meetings held deep in the forests. She wrote everything down, maintaining confessional secrecy, but her words betrayed a growing concern. Something was happening in those mountains, something the official Catholic community was unaware of or preferred to ignore. The other 2 nuns who accompanied her began to notice changes in Catherine's behavior. She spent hours alone in the chapel, praying silently, and when questioned, she would only say that she carried the weight of secrets she could not share. Winter was rapidly approaching, and with it, the feeling of isolation intensified. The roads became impossible, and the mission became a lost island among snow-covered mountains. It was in December that Catherine made a decision that would seal her fate. She wrote a lengthy letter to the Bishop of Baltimore, a letter that would never reach its intended destination. In that letter, she told about disturbing things she had found out about religious practices in that area. She named respected people, talked about rituals that combined Catholicism with much older ones, and asked for help right away on what to do next. The letter was later found hidden in the floorboards of the mission, where it had never been sent. Catherine went missing on Christmas Eve, December 23, 1849. All that was left were unanswered questions, and a trail that the Catholic Church would make sure was erased from official records. What really happened that cold night in the Appalachian Mountains? Why was her name systematically taken off of all church documents? And what did she find that was so dangerous that it had to be kept quiet forever? There was a heavy silence over the mission on the morning of December 24th, 1849. Catherine's 2 nuns woke up and didn't see her. It looked like her bed had never been used that night because it was still clean. Along with her, the rosary she always kept next to her bed was gone. The sisters were most interested in finding out that the main door was locked from the inside. The windows were closed, and there were no signs of a fight or disturbance. 3 days later, Buncombe County Sheriff Thomas Hricks was called in because it was clear that Catherine would not come back on her own. Hricks was known for being very good at finding missing people, which was common in that area because travelers often got lost on mountain trails. He looked into the case very carefully, talked to the nuns, and talked to people who lived in the area. Everyone said the same thing. They hadn't seen or heard anything strange that night. The county archives have the sheriff's records, which show some interesting information. Hricks said that he saw marks from candles that had just been put out in the chapel, which meant that someone had been there early in the morning. He also saw that Catherine's personal diary was open on the table, and the last entry was from December 22nd. She wrote about a revelation she had while praying in that last entry. It scared her and made her want to do something at the same time. The investigation went on for the next few weeks, but the search in the mountains was hard because of the cold weather. The trails were covered in snow, which erased all traces of people and turned the area into a white, impenetrable maze. Hricks put together search parties that looked for Catherine within a few kilometers of the mission, but they didn't find anything. It was as if she had just disappeared into the cold air of that winter night. When the sheriff said the nun's name, some residents acted strangely, which started to bother him. Some people looked away, some quickly changed the subject, and some showed a hidden fear, as if talking about Catherine could lead to problems. Hricks understood that this was more than just a simple disappearance. There were secrets in that community, and over time, layers of silence had built up around them. In February 1850, an old person went to see Hricks in private. The man, who didn't want his name written down, said that on the night of the disappearance, he saw lights moving toward the ruins of an old chapel that had been abandoned. The chapel was about 5 kilometers north of the mission. French colonists built this chapel many years ago, but it was left empty when the community moved away. The people who lived there didn't like it and stayed away from it even during the day. Hricks chose to look into the ruins. When he got to the site with 2 helpers, he saw a stone building that was partly collapsed and covered in moss and plants. The snow around the area had just been disturbed, and there were signs that several people had moved through it. The sheriff found something strange inside the empty chapel: candles arranged in a circle, fresh campfire ashes, and strange carvings on the stone walls that didn't look like they were part of the original Catholic decoration. It was even worse to find a piece of black fabric, like what nuns wear, stuck between the rocks. It looked like someone had ripped the fabric off of it. Hricks kept the evidence and kept looking into the case, but from then on, he ran into problems he didn't expect. In Raleigh, North Carolina's capital, higher-ups ordered the case to be closed because there weren't enough resources and it was too cold to keep looking. At first, the sheriff didn't want to give up the investigation, but he had to because higher-ups kept pushing him to do so. He wrote down a strange phrase in his personal records. "There are powers in this land that do not answer to the law of men, and secrets that wish to remain buried." A few months later, Hricks moved to a different county, taking with him papers that he never gave to the people who came after him. At the same time, the Catholic Church was doing its own thing. The 2 nuns who had been with Catherine were quietly moved to convents far away, one in Louisiana and the other in Pennsylvania. In March 1850, the mission in Asheville was officially closed because there weren't enough resources to keep it going. A local merchant bought the building and turned it into a warehouse. The diocesan archives started to lose all records about Sister Catherine Marlowe. For the next few years, no one talked about the case. In 1856, the mission where Catherine lived was torn down, and a grain warehouse was built in its place. People who knew the nun slowly moved away from the area or just stopped talking about it. It was like the people of Asheville and the mountains around it had made an unspoken agreement to forget. But secrets don't stay hidden for long. A historian named Edmund Whitmore came to Asheville in 1873 to study how Catholic religious orders were spreading across the southern Appalachian region. Whitmore was a methodical person who was obsessed with details. He had spent years gathering documents about missions that were set up in North Carolina in the 1800s. He found an interesting inconsistency while looking through records in the Buncombe County archives. There were some mentions of a mission run by nuns from 1849 to 1850, but no name or specific religious order was given. Whitmore was interested and started to look into it more. He found receipts for supplies signed by someone known only as Sister M, broken letters mentioning the nuns of the mountain mission, and a report from Sheriff Thomas Hicks about a missing person case that had not been solved. The historian knew he was dealing with something that had been purposely left out of the records. He was so curious about school that he was determined to find out what had been hidden. Whitmore went to Baltimore and asked to see the Sisters of Mercy's archives. At first, people were friendly to him there, but when he brought up Asheville in the year 1849, doors started to close. People in charge of the archives said that a fire that happened years ago had destroyed a lot of documents. When Whitmore pushed for at least a list of nuns who had worked in North Carolina during that time, he was told that this information was private and protected by religious secrecy. The historian was angry, but not ready to give up. He spent months talking to old people who had lived in Asheville at the time. Most people didn't want to talk, but one woman in her 80s who had been a girl when the mission was still going on agreed to share her memories. She remembered a dark-haired nun who went to see families in the mountains who were cut off from the rest of the world. She brought them medicine and spiritual comfort. This nun had kind eyes, but she was very sad, as if she knew something terrible that she couldn't tell anyone. The old woman also said something that made Whitmore stop writing and just listen. She said that on the night the nun went missing, her family heard strange noises coming from the old empty chapel. They were chants, and the men's voices were in harmony as they sang in a language she didn't know. Her father had locked all the doors and windows and told everyone to stay inside until morning. The next day, when word of her disappearance got out, her father only said, "She saw what she shouldn't have seen." With this information in hand, Whitmore chose to go to the ruins of the old chapel. The site had gotten even worse by 1873, and the forest had almost taken it over. But the historian didn't give up. He spent days looking around the area, taking pictures of the carvings on the stone walls, and copying symbols that combined Catholic imagery with other things he couldn't identify. He also discovered a small silver relic with locks of human hair and a piece of paper with names written in faded ink hidden in a hole below what was left of the altar. The names on the paper were of well-known people in Asheville at the time, such as respected merchants, a retired judge, and landowners. Whitmore wrote down the names carefully, but he didn't fully understand what he had found. When he got back to the city and started looking into these men, he found out that they had all done well after 1850, gaining wealth and power in a way that didn't seem fair given the opportunities in the area at the time. The historian wrote up his findings in a manuscript that he planned to publish as part of a bigger study on Catholic missions in the South. He called the chapter about Asheville "The Forgotten Nun of the Appalachians." Whitmore asked disturbing questions in the manuscript. Why had a nun been systematically erased from the records? What kind of information did she have that made her keep it a secret? And what did her disappearance have to do with the men whose names were hidden in that reliquary? Whitmore got scary visits before he could publish his work. Men in nice clothes showed up at his home in Boston and said they were from North Carolina, but didn't say who they were. They offered a lot of money in exchange for all the papers and notes about the Asheville case. Whitmore said no. A week later, someone broke into his office and stole all of his research materials. The original manuscript, along with pictures of the chapel ruins and copies of the names found on the reliquary, are gone. Edmund Whitmore gave up on the investigation because he was scared and discouraged. He never talked about the case of the missing nun in public again. He wrote in his personal notes, which were found decades after he died, "There are truths that society is not ready to face, and powers that go beyond what most people can understand. Catherine Marlowe found something in the shadows of Appalachia, and that something made sure she could never tell her story." Asheville became more modern in the 20th century, but it didn't get any answers. The city grew, roads were built, and tourism began to thrive in the mountains that had once been cut off from the rest of the world. In 1901, the old, ruined chapel was completely destroyed to make room for a road that would connect rural areas. Any physical evidence that might have still been there was ground up and lost. But stories have a strange way of staying alive, even when people try to bury them. In 1924, while workers were fixing up the old Asheville Town Hall, they found a hidden room behind a brick wall. There was a rusty metal box inside that held papers from the last century. One of them was a set of letters that Thomas Hricks, the sheriff who looked into Catherine's disappearance, had never sent before. These letters were sent to a district attorney in Raleigh and contained information that Hricks had never included in his official reports. The sheriff wrote in the letters that he had kept looking into the case even after being told to close it. He had quietly asked some of the local elite about their lives and found out that a lot of them were part of a secret society that met in remote mountain areas. The meetings themselves weren't against the law, but the fact that they were so secret was unsettling. Hricks thought that Catherine had found out about these meetings and that something about them had scared her deeply. The sheriff's conversation with an unnamed informant was even more revealing. This informant, who only went by the letter J, said they had been to a meeting in the empty chapel on December 23, 1849. He said that the nun had suddenly shown up at the meeting, which caused it to stop. She is said to have confronted those present, accusing them of disrespecting sacred teachings and doing things that are not in line with the Catholic faith. The informant said that Catherine was brave, even when she was alone in front of a group of powerful men. The informant said that what happened next was unclear. There were loud fights, hidden threats, and then Catherine was supposedly taken out of the chapel. The informant said they left before seeing what happened because they were too scared to stay. He told Hricks that he had been feeling guilty about that night ever since, but he was too scared of what would happen if he testified in court. The sheriff said in the letters that the informant went missing not long after this conversation and was never seen in the area again. Hricks' letters also had a scary idea in them. He thought that Catherine's disappearance wasn't just a coincidence, but that it had something to do with the secret activities of that group. The sheriff said that the nun had been silenced to protect reputations and keep secrets that could ruin powerful families. Hricks also said that he had sent a private letter to the Archbishop of Baltimore, telling him what he had found and asking the church to get involved. This made things even more interesting. There was no answer to this letter. The papers that were found in 1924 caused a brief stir in the area but were quickly put away again. The Asheville Press wrote a few articles about the discovery, but they didn't think it was very important. They thought it was just an interesting piece of history, but a journalist named Robert Clayton became very interested in the story and chose to look into it himself. People knew Clayton for his investigative work, and he wasn't easily scared. He started by finding the descendants of the families that Hricks wrote about. A lot of these families were still important in Asheville, where they held high positions in business and local politics. When Clayton started asking about things that happened in 1849, he got no answers and doors that were closed. Some descendants said they had no idea their ancestors were involved with secret societies at all. Some people just wouldn't talk to him. Clayton looked into Catholic Church archives as well. He went to Baltimore and was only able to see some old letters from the diocese. There, he found something amazing. A short mention of the North Carolina incident in an 1850 record, and a note saying that appropriate measures were taken to preserve the reputation of the order. There were no more details, but the way the church spoke made it seem like they knew something bad was going on and chose to keep it quiet. The journalist also found out that the Sisters of Mercy's archives had no official record of Catherine Marlowe's existence at all. It was like she had never joined the order, never taken her vows, or even been born. The fact that there was no paperwork at all was proof in itself. Someone had worked very hard to get rid of all signs of her presence. Clayton wrote in his personal notes, "I am sure that Catherine Marlowe found something that scared powerful people, both religious and secular. Her disappearance was not an accident, and the erasure of her existence was planned and carried out. But what exactly did she find, and why does this secret still need to be kept after so many years?" The journalist promised himself that he would keep looking for answers. Robert Clayton, on the other hand, never published his research. In 1926, he died in what was officially reported as a car accident on winding mountain roads. His vehicle went off the road during a storm and plunged into a ravine. All his notes on the Catherine Marlowe case were in the car and were destroyed in the accident. Friends of the journalist expressed doubts about the official version, but no further investigation was conducted. The following decades witnessed an almost complete silence surrounding the case. The Great Depression, World War II, and the social transformations that swept across the United States relegated the mysteries of the 19th century to forgotten footnotes. Asheville continued to thrive as a tourist destination, known for its stunning scenery and pure mountain air. Very few people remembered the nun who had gone missing almost 100 years before, and those who didn't want to say anything. The case didn't come back up until 1967, which was a surprise. Margaret Sinclair, a retired teacher, was sorting through old papers that had been given to the Asheville Public Library when she found a diary that had been partially burned. The remaining pages were weak, and the ink had faded, but it was still readable. She was shocked to learn that the diary belonged to one of the nuns who went with Catherine Marlowe on the 1849 mission. The diary had been kept by Sister Elizabeth, one of the two nuns who witnessed the disappearance. The entries covered the period from March to December 1849, with the last entry dated December 25th, the day after Catherine's disappearance. The pages revealed an intimate perspective on the events that preceded that fateful night, and what was written there was deeply disturbing. Sister Elizabeth described Catherine as a woman of firm convictions, but one who had become increasingly distressed by what she discovered in her interactions with the local community. Catherine had begun to notice inconsistencies in the religious practices of some families. There were rituals performed in secret, mixing Catholic elements with traditions that seemed to come from other sources. When she questioned these behaviors, she received evasive answers or veiled hostility. In a November entry, Elizabeth wrote about an evening when Catherine returned to the mission visibly disturbed. She had been invited to dinner at the residence of a prominent merchant, and during the visit noticed strange symbols discreetly engraved on the wooden beams of the house. When she inquired about them, the host quickly changed the subject, and the atmosphere became tense. Catherine commented to Elizabeth that those symbols had nothing to do with traditional Catholicism. The diary also revealed that Catherine had begun documenting everything she discovered. She kept a second notebook separate from her personal diary, where she recorded names, dates, and descriptions of suspicious practices. Elizabeth mentioned this notebook several times, referring to it as the record of shadows. Catherine kept this document hidden, and only Elizabeth knew of its existence. The nun feared that if the information contained in that notebook were discovered by the wrong people, there would be serious consequences. Elizabeth wrote in her journal on December 22nd, the day before Catherine went missing, that Catherine had made a choice. She would confront those responsible for the secret practices, taking with her evidence of what she had discovered. Elizabeth tried to dissuade her, arguing that it was dangerous to act alone. But Catherine was determined. She believed she had a moral duty to expose what was happening, even if it put her own safety at risk. The last diary entry was the most revealing and distressing. Elizabeth wrote on the morning of December 25th, with trembling handwriting and hurried words. She described how she had woken up in the middle of the night the previous day and realized that Catherine was not on the mission. Searching for the hidden notebook, she discovered that it too had disappeared. Elizabeth left discreetly and followed footprints in the fresh snow that led towards the mountains. The footprints were only Catherine's. There were no signs that she had been forced to leave. Elizabeth followed the footprints for about 2 kilometers until she lost them in a rocky area where the snow didn't accumulate. There, she stopped, overcome by an inexplicable fear. She wrote that she felt a sinister presence in that place, as if something invisible were watching her from the shadows of the trees. She decided to return to her mission and wait for dawn to seek help. But when the sheriff finally arrived days later, Elizabeth made no mention of having followed the footprints or of Catherine's secret notebook. The diary ended with an enigmatic sentence: "I know what happened to her, and carrying this knowledge is a burden that will accompany me until my last day. May God have mercy on her soul, and mine, for my silence." There were no more entries after that. The following pages had been torn out or burned. There was no way to know. Margaret Sinclair was deeply disturbed by the discovery. She made copies of the diary and gave them to the police, hoping that someone would finally look into the case seriously after all these years. But the answer was disappointing. A historian for the city looked at the document and said that, while it was interesting from a historical point of view, there was nothing that could be done about such an old case. There was no proof of a crime, and events that happened more than 100 years ago don't fall under the law. The teacher didn't give up easily. She wrote articles for local newspapers, talked to small radio stations, and tried to get people interested in the mystery. Some people were interested, but most thought the story was just an Appalachian urban legend that wasn't true. Margaret learned that talking about it also drew unwanted attention. She started getting phone calls at night from people who didn't say anything, and letters with no return address telling her to stop getting involved in things that don't concern her. Margaret was scared but determined to give it one last try. She went to the site of the old mission, which is now a parking lot for businesses, and then to the area where the chapel used to be. There, where there used to be historical ruins, she only saw a modern road cutting through the landscape. There were no more physical signs of the past, no signs, no reminders that anything important had ever happened there. That day, Margaret Sinclair came home feeling like she was up against unseen forces that wanted to keep the past buried. She put copies of Sister Elizabeth's diary in a bank vault and chose to do things differently. Instead of trying to get attention from the public, she quietly looked for descendants of the families involved, hoping that someone, after so many generations, would be willing to tell the truth that had been kept hidden for so long. After months of genealogical research, Margaret finally found an elderly woman named Dorothy Ashford. She was the great-granddaughter of one of the men whose names were mentioned in old documents related to the case. Dorothy lived alone on a remote farm outside of Asheville, away from the city and other people. When Margaret called her, she was polite but firm in saying no at first. But the professor's persistence must have moved the old woman in some way because, weeks later, Dorothy called and asked to see her. It was a fall afternoon in 1968 when the meeting took place. Dorothy was 86 years old, but her mind was clear and her memory was sharp. She served tea in old porcelain cups and started to talk, but only after making Margaret promise that nothing she said would be published while she was still alive. The professor agreed because she was so eager to finally hear the truth, even if she had to wait years to tell it. Dorothy said that her family had always known about Catherine Marlowe and what happened in 1849. The story had been passed down from generation to generation, always in secret, and with strict warnings that it should never be talked about outside of the family. Henry Ashford, her great-grandfather, was a member of the secret society that met in the mountains. The family's story says that the group of men in question was not evil or criminal, but rather a group of men who wanted to learn more about spirituality than what traditional religious institutions allowed. Most of the people who joined were Protestants and Catholics, who felt like their church's strict rules were too much for them. They read old texts, looked into different ways of thinking, and did ceremonies that mixed parts of different traditions. They thought it was a real search for deeper spiritual truths. They kept it a secret because they were afraid of being persecuted for their beliefs, and because they knew that people at the time wouldn't understand or accept what they were doing. Catherine Marlowe learned about these meetings through confessions and her own observations. At first, the members of the group tried to talk to her, explain why they were doing what they were doing, and convince her that there was nothing wrong with what they were doing. But Catherine, who followed the strict teachings of the Catholic Church, thought those practices were dangerous heresy. She said she would tell everyone about them, even the church authorities, and make sure they were punished. Dorothy says that on December 23, 1849, Catherine went to the old chapel where the group was meeting. She brought with her the notebook with all the proof she had gathered: names, dates, and detailed descriptions. A heated argument broke out. The men tried to talk her out of it by promising to end the meetings and begging her not to ruin their families and reputations, but Catherine wouldn't budge. She was morally opposed to any compromise. Dorothy said quietly that what happened next was something her family had always been very sorry about. People made bad choices because of the stress and hopelessness. Catherine wasn't hurt physically, and the old woman made sure to make that clear. However, she was taken to an even more remote part of the mountains against her will. At first, they planned to keep her there until they could convince her not to tell the police about the group, or at least until they could find a way to keep everyone safe. But the cold winter made things even harder. That night, the snow started to fall heavily, making trails impassable and making it very dangerous to move around. The group broke up, promising to come back as soon as things got better. Catherine wasn't there when they finally got back days later. There were signs that she had tried to leave by herself, going through the snowstorm in an unknown direction. They looked for her, but the mountains had hidden all signs of her. Dorothy said that her great-grandfather felt bad about that event for the rest of his life. He thought that Catherine had gotten lost in the snow and died from the cold in the mountains, which were not very friendly. The group chose not to tell anyone what had happened because that would mean admitting to the kidnapping and their secret plans. Instead, they stayed quiet and used their power to make sure the case wasn't fully looked into. Catherine's notebook of evidence went missing with her. Dorothy said that maybe the nun had hidden it somewhere while trying to escape, or that it had been lost in the snow. Her family was always afraid that the notebook would be found one day, revealing things they would rather keep secret. Over the years, whenever someone got too close to the case, powerful members of these families used their money and connections to stop or discourage the research. Margaret listened without saying anything, taking in what she heard. The teacher asked Dorothy about Catherine's erasure from the church records after she was done. The elder sighed and said that her family had always thought that someone in the group had ties to the diocese. This contact would have been used to make sure that the church helped keep the incident quiet after the person went missing. A scandal involving a nun and a secret society wouldn't help anyone, not even the church or the families involved. Dorothy ended her story with a sad comment. She said that her family had done well over the years, gaining wealth and power, but there was always a dark cloud over them. Everyone felt the need to protect the memory of their ancestors, even though no one alive was directly responsible for what happened. She hoped that the cycle of silence would finally end, but only after she died. Margaret thanked her for trusting her and kept her word. She kept that conversation a secret for the next few years, only seeing Dorothy now and then until the old woman died in 1972. The professor only then wrote a full report on everything she had learned, but when she tried to get it published, no one was interested. The case was too old, too controversial, and there wasn't enough clear evidence that could be checked by someone else. There were new technologies and ways to study history in the 1980s, but the mystery of Catherine Marlowe was still hidden behind layers of time and silence. Margaret Sinclair passed away in 1979 and gave her archives to the Asheville Historical Library. For over 10 years, those papers stayed in closed boxes, where they were cataloged but hardly ever looked at. The story of the missing nun looked like it would always be a footnote in the history of Appalachia. Jennifer Hayes was a graduate student in 1994, working on her doctoral dissertation about the history of Catholic religious orders in the southern United States. Jennifer found Sister Elizabeth's diary and the professor's detailed notes over the years while going through archives that Margaret Sinclair had given to the school. The young researcher was instantly interested. This case had a historical mystery, questions about institutional power, and a deeply moving story about a person. Jennifer chose to use modern research methods on the case. She started by using digitized records that were becoming more and more available thanks to efforts to preserve history. She looked through genealogical databases, property records, court documents, and official letters. Slowly, she started to put together a more complete picture of Asheville in 1849 and the people who lived there. One of her most important finds came from looking at immigration records. Jennifer found proof that a number of the men who were part of the secret society came to the United States from Europe in the middle of the 1840s. A lot of them were political or religious refugees who were escaping persecution in their home countries. This helped explain why they looked for other ways to express their spirituality that weren't tied to established institutions. The researcher also found that the Asheville area had a very interesting history of religious diversity that was kept secret. In the 19th century, the Appalachian Mountains were a safe place for outcasts to practice their beliefs. There were groups of Quakers, dissenting Methodists, spiritualists, and other people who didn't fit into traditional churches. In this context, the existence of a secret society investigating alternative philosophies was not as remarkable as it initially seemed. Jennifer also found old weather records that showed that the winter of 1849 to 1850 was very bad. From December to February, the area was hit by strong snowstorms over and over again. The temperature dropped to dangerous levels, and there were reports of several deaths from being too cold during that time. This made the Ashford family's story about Catherine getting lost in a storm seem more believable. But the researcher was worried about the inconsistencies. If Catherine really died in the mountains because of the cold, why was her body never found? Sheriff Pricks's searches had been very thorough, and even though there was snow on the ground, it was thought that some trace would be found in the spring when the snow melted. Hunters or settlers eventually found the bodies of travelers who had gone missing in the mountains at that time, but there was no record of finding human remains that could be linked to the missing nun. Jennifer was also interested in how Catherine had been completely erased from church records. It was very strange for the church to get rid of all records about a nun, even if they wanted to avoid a scandal. It showed a level of planning and determination that went beyond just wanting to forget about an embarrassing event. Someone in charge had decided that Catherine Marlowe should be completely erased from history. The researcher tried to get in touch with the Sisters of Mercy again, decades after Edmund Whitmore's attempts. This time, she was able to get limited access to some archives by using her academic credentials and a more formal approach. What she found was revealing because it wasn't there. There were very detailed records of almost every nun who worked for the order in the 1800s, but these papers didn't have any information about Catherine Marlowe. There was no record of her entry, vows, appointments, or even her name. But Jennifer found something very important. She found a document from 1848 that listed nuns who were sent on missions to new areas before they went missing. One of the names mentioned was Sister C.M., who was going to North Carolina. There were only initials, not a full name. When Jennifer asked to see the papers for this assignment, she was told that they had been lost during a file reorganization. It was too strange that the two things happened at the same time. The student also looked into what happened to Sister Elizabeth, who wrote the diary. She found out from the order's records that Elizabeth had been moved to a remote convent in Louisiana not long after the Asheville incident. She lived there until she died in 1882. According to the order's custom, all of the letters Elizabeth wrote over the years should have been kept, but none of them survived. Someone had gone through the record and taken out everything that could have anything to do with what happened in 1849. Jennifer put all of these findings in her thesis, and she even wrote a whole chapter about the Catherine Marlowe case. Her academic advisor told her to be careful about what she said, reminding her that a thesis should be based on facts and not guesses. The researcher concurred and maintained her analysis within suitable academic confines. But in her private notes, she said she was sure that there had been a conspiracy of silence that had lasted for generations. The university archives received the thesis in 1996 and gave it their stamp of approval. Jennifer wrote some academic articles about certain parts of her research, but no one really cared about Catherine's case. Historians mostly agreed that it was impossible to make firm conclusions about what really happened without physical evidence or clear documentation. The mystery stayed a mystery with no clear answer. But Jennifer didn't give up completely. She stayed in touch with historians in Asheville and kept gathering information over the years. She found out about something in 2003 that made her want to learn more. While digging for a new housing development in the mountains near Asheville, workers discovered what looked like the entrance to a fake cave or tunnel that had been covered by dirt and plants. Local authorities looked into it for a short time, but decided it was just an old, abandoned mine from the 1800s, which are common in that area. As soon as she heard about the discovery, Jennifer Hayes went to Asheville. She got to the excavation site and was determined to look into the old underground structure herself. Based on her research of old maps, she thought that the construction site was fairly close to where the old abandoned chapel used to be. It was too important to ignore the coincidence. At first, the people in charge of the project wouldn't let anyone into the building because they were worried about safety and the tight construction schedule. But Jennifer kept going. She called the county's Historic Preservation Department and said that any old building should be properly documented before it is torn down or sealed off. After a few weeks of dealing with red tape, she got the go-ahead for a supervised visit to the site. The entrance to the building was small, partly collapsed, and led to a narrow tunnel that had been cut into rock and dirt. Jennifer, along with a historical building expert and a representative from the construction company, carefully made her way down the uneven steps. The air was thick and damp, and it smelled like old dirt and rotting plants. The walls were clearly worked on by hand, with tool marks that were made long before modern machines. The tunnel went on for about 15 meters before opening up into a bigger room. The visitors found something unexpected inside, where modern lanterns lit the way. The chamber was not a simple mine, but appeared to have been built with a specific purpose. The walls featured niches carved at regular intervals, and the ceiling was supported by ancient wooden beams that miraculously still held their shape, although extremely deteriorated. Even more remarkable was what remained on the floor of the chamber. There were fragments of candles consumed by time, pieces of corroded metal that could have been candlesticks or other ritual objects, and engravings on the walls similar to those that had been documented in the old chapel demolished decades before. Jennifer meticulously photographed everything, her heart racing at the possibility of having found the secret place where the occult society actually met. While examining the niches in the walls, the researcher found something that chilled her blood. In one of the niches, protected from moisture by a fortuitous combination of protruding rocks, there was an object wrapped in decaying fabric. With trembling hands and wearing appropriate gloves, Jennifer carefully removed the object. It was a small book with a leather cover, hardened by time, but surprisingly intact considering the decades it had spent there. The pages of the book were stained and fragile, but legible. And on the first page, written in delicate and deliberate handwriting, was a name, Catherine Marlowe. It was the lost notebook, the record of the shadows, that Sister Elizabeth had mentioned in her diary. After more than 150 years, the evidence that Catherine had compiled was finally coming to light. Jennifer didn't open the notebook right there, aware that the document needed to be handled by professionals in a controlled environment. She took pictures of it at the place where it was found, carefully wrote down its location and context, and then took it with her with the permission of the people in charge. In the following days, working with document conservators, she began the meticulous process of digitizing and transcribing the notebook's contents. What was written there confirmed a lot of what Jennifer had thought. Catherine had documented names, dates of meetings, descriptions of ceremonies and practices that blended elements of various spiritual traditions. There were references to Gnostic texts, Hermetic philosophies, and rituals that incorporated pagan symbolism along with Christian elements. By the religious standards of 1849, this would have been considered clear and dangerous heresy, but the notebook contained something more. In the final pages, seemingly written in haste, Catherine described her decision to confront the group and her determination to expose what she considered a serious spiritual corruption. She wrote about receiving veiled threats, about feeling she was being followed, and about her fear that something might happen to her. The last entry was dated December 23, 1849, written hours before her disappearance. In this final entry, Catherine explained that she was hiding the notebook in a safe place in case something happened to her. She hoped that if it disappeared, someone would eventually find her notes, and the truth would come to light. It was a message from the past, a nun sending her testimony through time in the hope that justice, even if delayed, would prevail. Jennifer was moved as she read those words. Catherine knew she was in danger, but she still carried on with her moral conviction. The researcher spent weeks analyzing the notebook, cross-referencing the information contained therein with other historical documents. Everything fit together. The names mentioned corresponded to prominent figures in Asheville at that time. The dates of the meetings coincided with periods when these men would have been in the region. The discovery generated moderate interest in academic circles. Jennifer published articles about the find, and the notebook was eventually donated to the Asheville Historical Society after being fully digitized. Some descendants of the families mentioned in the document spoke out, some defending their ancestors as misunderstood men who were merely seeking religious freedom, others expressing embarrassment at their ancestors' involvement in Catherine's disappearance. But the discovery of the notebook, while significant, still didn't solve the fundamental mystery. What really happened to Catherine Marlowe that night? The notebook was hidden in the underground chamber, suggesting she had been there at some point. But how had she gotten out? Where had she gone? And why was she never found? Jennifer developed a theory based on all the available evidence. She believed that Catherine had hidden the notebook in the underground chamber before going to the abandoned chapel for the final confrontation. This would have been a precaution, ensuring that her findings wouldn't be lost even if something happened to her. After the confrontation, when she was taken against her will, she would have tried to escape during the snowstorm, but the extreme conditions would have been fatal. According to this theory, Catherine's body was probably still somewhere in the mountains, perhaps in a deep ravine or natural cave, where it would never be found. The Appalachian Mountains are full of secrets, and at that time, people often went missing without a trace. The wild had taken the nun, and time had finished the job of making her body disappear from the world. Jennifer thought that someone with connections, probably one of the powerful members of the secret society, had told the church about the case because the church was systematically erasing records. The institution chose to keep things completely private because there was a chance of a scandal involving one of its nuns and accusations of heresy against well-known people. It was easier to erase Catherine from the records than to deal with the complicated effects of her moral crusade. In the years that followed, people slowly changed their minds about the Catherine Marlowe case. Jennifer Hayes' work had finally given voice to a woman who had been quiet for more than 100 years. In the 19th century, historians started to look again at the role of women's religious orders, especially in frontier areas where these women often faced dangers and challenges that traditional historical accounts tended to downplay or ignore. The Asheville Historical Society put on an exhibit in 2008 about people from the past who have been forgotten. Catherine Marlowe was the main focus, with her digitized diary, pictures of the underground room where the notebook was found, and a detailed timeline of what happened in 1849. The exhibition drew a lot of interest, not just from academics who were interested in the mystery, but also from people who lived nearby who were curious about this dark time in their city's history that many had never heard of. The gallery walls were covered with big pages from Catherine's notebook. Her carefully written words were now big enough for visitors to read her private thoughts and growing worries. There were maps that showed where the old mission, the abandoned chapel, and the underground chamber that was found in 2003 were. Old photos from the archives show what Asheville looked like in the 1800s. A small town in the mountains that kept its people safe and separate from the rest of the world. There was a lot of controversy around the show as well. Some descendants of the families involved protested strongly, saying that the presentation made their ancestors look like bad guys when they were really just men who wanted to be free to think for themselves in a time of extreme religious intolerance. They remembered that a lot of those men had left Europe to escape persecution and moved to the mountains of North Carolina to get away from strict rules. Others, however, praised the effort, seeing it as a chance to finally face uncomfortable truths that had been hidden away for too long. Some families openly said that stories about strange events in 1849 had been passed down through the generations in their homes, always with warnings not to talk about them in public. Something totally unexpected happened during the show that would change how people thought about the case again. In the third week of the exhibit, an old man named Marcus Hurricks came to see it and told the organizers something surprising. Sheriff Thomas Hurricks was the first person to look into Catherine's disappearance, and Marcus was his great-great-grandson. He brought with him an old wooden box that held family documents that had never been made public. These were papers that his ancestor had kept until he died, and that had been passed down through the generations as a kind of secret heirloom. Marcus said that his great-great-grandfather's will had clear instructions. The papers in the box shouldn't have been thrown away, but they also shouldn't have been shown to anyone until the truth about Catherine Marlowe started to come out in other ways. Thomas Hurricks knew that one day, after enough time had passed, and the people involved were dead, someone would start to ask the right questions. The papers could only be useful if they didn't put living people in danger. One of these papers was a letter that Thomas Ricks wrote to his older brother in 1851, 2 years after he went missing. The letter from the former sheriff talked about something he had found out just before he left Buncombe County. He had found an informant who was willing to talk. This person had been on the fringes of the secret society's meetings and felt terrible about what had happened. This informant, whose story is told in Ricks's letter, says that Catherine didn't just get lost in the storm by accident. She had been taken to the underground chamber, the same one that was found decades later during construction, and kept there while the group talked about what to do about the impossible situation they were in. The informant kept saying that the goal was never to hurt her physically, but rather to use logic to get her to destroy her notes and promise not to talk about what she had found. There were heated arguments in the chamber for several hours on that cold December night. Some people in the group tried to get Catherine to feel sorry for them by saying that their families would be ruined if they were publicly exposed. Some people used theological arguments to say that their actions were not anti-Christian, but rather a search for deeper spiritual truths that established religious institutions had kept hidden for hundreds of years. Men knelt down in front of her and begged her to think about the mercy that her own faith taught. They offered her money and promised that the group would break up for good if she would just promise not to tell anyone their names. One of the richer members offered to give a lot of money to the mission, which would let Catherine do more charitable work in the area. She just had to forget what she had seen. Catherine, on the other hand, was completely unyielding. She couldn't compromise on what she saw as dangerous departures from spiritual truth because of her faith. She answered each argument with unwavering conviction, quoting scripture, calling on the church's authority, and saying that practices that mixed sacred teachings with pagan philosophies were doors through which demons could enter. There was no way for her to be in the middle between light and dark. She told the men who were there that they could keep her locked up, but that eventually the other nuns, then the sheriff, and finally higher church officials would come looking for her. She said that everything would come out anyway, and that keeping a nun against her will would only make her crimes worse in the eyes of the law and the church. The situation was getting worse and worse. The informant told Ricks that the hours were dragging on, and that some people in the group were starting to think about more extreme measures. People were talking about keeping Catherine locked up for a long time, maybe even moving her to another state without telling anyone, or even paying off officials to say that she had left the area on her own. The emotional temperature in the underground room was going up dangerously while the outside temperature was going down. At that point, the storm outside got a lot worse. The wind howled through the trees with such force that the ground shook, and the snow fell so heavily that you couldn't see more than a few steps ahead. The storm seemed to be a physical sign of the stress that was building up in that secret room in the mountains. Some of the men there, who were superstitious even though they acted like they were philosophers, started to think that the storm was a sign that they had gone too far. One of the group's youngest members, a man the informant didn't name but said was under 30, became more and more upset. He was scared that the situation could get worse and worse until it reached a point of no return. He suddenly stood up, walked to the door of the room, and opened it, even though older members were against it. He turned to Catherine and told her she could go. He hoped that the act would make him feel better about himself and that the storm would stop her from going too far into the cold and dark. She might change her mind when she saw how bad things really were, or she might just wait nearby until the storm passed and negotiations could start again in the morning. Catherine didn't think twice. The informant said that she grabbed her rosary, did her best to fix her habit, and then left right away into the blizzard without looking back. She didn't have a proper cloak to keep her warm, food, or a lantern to light her way through the dark. She was only motivated by her strong desire to get to safety and tell what had happened, trusting that her faith would keep her safe when she didn't have any other resources. The men there were completely shocked by her choice. They were shocked and silent for a moment as they tried to figure out what had just happened. Then they started talking about how to get to her right away. Some people were too scared to move because they were afraid of being seen, while others used the storm's real danger as an excuse not to do anything. They thought that she would soon see how wrong her choice was and come back, or that she would find shelter in a nearby cabin, or that her miraculous faith would really lead her to safety. But Catherine never came back. There was no sign of her 2 days later, when the storm finally passed and they finally found the courage to look for her. The snow had covered everything in those 2 days, making the whole area look like a blank white space that hid any signs of her path. The informant told Hrix that this decision haunted each of the men present for the rest of their lives, visiting them in nightmares and moments of guilty conscience. At the end of Hrix's letter, he wrote a very sad thought that showed how heavy this case had been on his mind. He told his brother that he had confirmed many parts of this story through other independent sources over months of quiet investigation, and was completely sure it was true. Every detail he could verify fit perfectly with the informant's testimony, creating a disturbing mosaic of human decisions that led to an avoidable tragedy. The sheriff had tried to officially reopen the investigation, armed with this new information, preparing detailed reports and requesting resources for a renewed search in the mountains as soon as spring melted the snow. But he was quickly informed by superiors in Raleigh that the case was definitively closed and that reviving the matter would benefit absolutely no one. The words used were polite, but the message was crystal clear. Let the dead rest in peace and do not disturb still waters. Hrix understood at that moment that forces far beyond his control had decided that the truth would remain buried along with Catherine in the icy Appalachian mountains. It wasn't just the local influential families protecting their secrets, but a wider network of interests that extended to the state capital and possibly beyond. The political and social cost of exposing the truth was considered too high, especially when the victim was just a nun without a powerful family to demand justice. The sheriff wrote to his brother that he could no longer continue serving in a place where justice could be so easily suppressed for convenience. He left Buncombe County a few months after that letter, moving to a remote region of Kentucky where he could start over, away from the shadows that haunted him. But he kept all the documents related to the case, carefully guarding them with instructions so that the truth could eventually emerge when the time was right. The revelation of Hrix's documents in the 2008 exhibition added an even deeper and more complex tragic dimension to the case. Catherine had literally chosen to face a deadly storm rather than compromise her religious principles, a decision that reflected both her extraordinary courage and the absolute impossibility of dialogue between such radically different worldviews that shared no common ground. The men who confronted her that night were not monsters from horror stories, but ordinary people who made terrible decisions under extreme pressure. Decisions whose unintended consequences would haunt them like ghosts for the rest of their lives. It was a tragedy in the most classic sense of the word, where good intentions and human failings combined to create a devastating outcome that no one truly wanted. The Asheville Historical Society immediately updated its exhibit with this new information brought to light by Marcus Hrix. The sheriff's letters were digitized and added to the collection, and explanatory panels were created to contextualize the revelations. Jennifer Hayes, now a respected history professor at a North Carolina university, was invited to lecture on the case, sharing her decades of research with ever-growing audiences. Jennifer decided it was time to consolidate all the accumulated knowledge about Catherine Marlowe into a definitive work. She spent 2 years writing a book that was published in 2010 under the title Voices in the Mountains, The Lost Story of Catherine Marlowe and the Secrets of the Appalachians. The book was neither sensationalist nor artificially dramatic, but rather a careful and deeply empathetic analysis of how personal convictions, institutional power, and tragic circumstances combined to create a historical injustice that spanned generations. The work received extraordinarily positive reviews from historians and academics, being praised for its meticulous research and its refusal to oversimplify the moral complexities of the case. Jennifer did not make Catherine out to be a perfect saint or the people in the secret society out to be one-dimensional villains. Instead, she presented them as flawed human beings, navigating impossible dilemmas in a time and place where social structures were very different from those of today. The book made people more interested in the Catherine Marlowe mystery, and it reached a lot more people than just academics. Reading groups talked about its pages, history podcasts made whole episodes about the story, and tourists started coming to Asheville just to see places that were important to the case. The city, which has always been proud of its long history, slowly began to accept this dark story as part of its heritage. The Catholic Diocese of North Carolina made an official statement about the case in 2012 that surprised many people. It admitted that serious mistakes had been made in the past. The institution said it was very sorry for the systematic erasure of Catherine from church records and for not doing a better job of looking into her disappearance at the time. The statement said that the desire to avoid scandal had taken precedence over the search for truth and justice. The diocese said that it was officially putting Catherine Marlowe's name back on the records of the Sisters of Mercy, which means that they are now recognizing her service and sacrifice. The statement didn't give clear answers about what happened that night in December, but it was an important admission that the silence of institutions had a big part in keeping an injustice going. It was a small but very important step toward moral reparation and historical truth. Activists and members of Asheville's historic community started a strong campaign to build a permanent memorial to Catherine Marlowe. Some families were very against the first proposal because they didn't like how much attention the case was getting, but over time it got a lot of support. The winning argument was that honoring Catherine didn't mean condemning everyone who was involved in her disappearance forever, but rather recognizing that stories that have been silenced should be told. The memorial would be a simple bronze plaque in a park near the site of the old mission. It would honor not only Catherine, but also all the women whose stories have been silenced, erased, or changed throughout American history. After months of discussion, the inscription was carefully written to honor Catherine as a woman of strong faith who paid the ultimate price for her beliefs. The memorial's opening ceremony took place in December 2013, exactly 164 years after she went missing. The Appalachian Mountains stood out against the clear blue sky on a cold but clear day. There were descendants of several families involved in the case there, and some had come from faraway states to be a part of this historic moment of reconciliation. Representatives from the Catholic Diocese held a short religious ceremony to bless the memorial and pray for Catherine's soul. They asked Jennifer Hayes to give a speech at the ceremony. She cried as she talked about the long journey it took to tell Catherine's story, about all the people who had pieces of the truth over the years and were waiting for the right time to share them. She thought about how the case showed universal truths about moral courage, the difficulties of faith, and the risks of letting powerful institutions hide inconvenient truths. But the most touching part of the ceremony may have been when an old nun from the Sisters of Mercy, who had come all the way from Baltimore, laid a wreath at the base of the memorial. She read aloud Catherine's last diary entry, which she had written just hours before her death. Her voice echoed through the quiet park. It was as if Catherine was finally able to talk across time and people were finally able to hear her message. In the years that followed, the memorial became an unexpected place for people to visit. People came not only to learn about history, but also to be inspired by the story of a woman who stayed true to herself until the end. Students of ethics came to think about moral problems. People of different faiths came to pray, and historians kept looking for that last piece of evidence that would finally solve all the remaining mysteries. Even with all that has been learned, there are still basic questions that don't have clear answers. Where did Catherine die in that storm? Is her body still in the mountains, maybe in a deep ravine or a cave that no one has found yet? Or has nature already taken back her body completely, putting it back in the ground in a way that will never let anyone know who she was? And there were other questions that could never be completely answered. What did Catherine feel as she walked alone in that deadly storm? Did she have faith that would keep her going until the end? Did she regret not negotiating, or did she die peacefully, knowing she had stuck to her beliefs? Catherine was the only one who could answer these questions, and she took those answers with her wherever she went. The deep valleys and old forests of the Appalachian Mountains hide a lot of secrets. Over the years, they have seen countless human dramas, including stories of bravery and cowardice, faith and betrayal, love and loss. Catherine Marlowe's story is just one of many, but it reminds us that every life is important. Every voice should be heard, and the truth will always come out, no matter how long it takes. Few people who walk around Asheville or hike in the nearby mountains today know that they are walking on ground that holds such deep secrets. The city has grown, changed, and become a popular tourist spot known for its craft beers and lively art scene. But if you listen closely, you can still hear echoes of the past beneath the modern surface. The Appalachian nun who was erased from the records has finally gotten her place back in history. She is no longer a forgotten footnote, but a powerful reminder that truth matters, that justice has value even when it takes a long time, and that voices that have been silenced will eventually be heard again. More than 150 years passed before Catherine Marlowe told her story. Finally, she did, and we listened. If you've made it this far on this journey through the shadows of the past, I hope you found something that makes you think about how complicated people are and how time can hide things. This channel is here to share disturbing stories like this one, mysteries that make us think about what we thought we knew and question what we thought we knew. If you liked this in-depth look at the forgotten parts of American history, please give it a thumbs up so that more people can find these interesting stories. Don't miss the next cases we look at together. Subscribe to the channel and turn on the bell. Please let us know what you thought of this story in the comments. Do you think Catherine did the right thing by not negotiating, or was there another way she could have gone? I love reading every comment because your opinion matters. Until the next time we go on a journey through the dark secrets that the past has kept from us.